we want to tax?
The polluters!
When do we want it?
Now!
Who do we want to tax?
We are here today because EU citizens are sick and tired of paying the price of the energy crisis and the climate catastrophe, while the big polluters cash in and getting richer and richer.
Who do we want to tax?
The polluters!
This week, meters away from here, the EU leaders are going to meet at the European Council, and there is one thing they can do to stop this, which is taxing fossil fuel profits.
Who do we want to tax?
The polluters!
When do we want it? Now!
We are calling for a permanent additional taxes on fossil fuel profits, which should be introduced on the national level, on the EU level, and on the global level. We need this money to tackle the energy crisis, for public services, and to transition away from fossil fuels. And this money needs to come from the pockets of the polluters and not from the citizens.
Make polluters pay!
As the war on Iran is showing once again, it's urgent for Europe to cut its dependence on fossil fuel and to move away from what is damaging our planet. The burden of the current crisis is not shared fairly. EU government cannot leave people cope alone with rising energy prices. They need to act and tax fossil fuel profiteers.
Make polluters pay! Make polluters pay! Make polluters pay! Make polluters pay!
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming back after lunch. I think this was a great opening for the tax discussion. It's another issue that we're working on. Of course, this is about the UN Tax Convention, but I just want to say that what you watched was something that we found it very hard to imagine just 6 months ago, actually, and even more hard to imagine when we first welcomed Marcus to our team, because was that 2024, Marcus? 23. And environmental tax was by definition regressive. That's how everyone understood it. So if you do environmental tax, you worsen inequalities. That was really the only approach that was discussed. And so enter Marcus, stolen from Greenpeace. We thought maybe we can steal some of his connections too. And Marcus's task was, can you try and make progressive environmental tax a thing? And can you just try and get that to be something? And we tried to search online to see if anyone had said something. There were a few people that had considered that maybe you could do other types of environmental taxes. It's been a long journey, a very important report written by Marcus last year about how you could do a tax on fossil fuel profits. And it's in the back, by the way. And since then, things have just evolved very rapidly. So what you saw was the culmination of, in January, we were like, oh, it would be so nice to work more with Climate Action Network and we got invited to the General Assembly. We were like, oh, this is cool. And then suddenly, after a lot of fantastic discussions, we were like, okay, let's just get to work. So let's do a stunt outside the council where we call for taxes on fossil fuel profits. And this was in close collaboration with Eurodad members, first and foremost, CNCD. Thank you so much for a lot of fun yesterday. Sasenyata and ISIP, and a lot of the Eurodad members have supported this. We also worked with Transport and Environment, and suddenly this week, a lot of organizations wanted to sign on to the press release. So it ended up being with 350.org, and Global Witness came jumping in, and suddenly we're just all, yes, we agree. Now let's go and scream at the governments. So I think this was, I don't know what you call it. I think this was not a one-day stunt. I think this was the start. I think we ended yesterday by saying we should do this again. And so very, very exciting what's going on progressive environmental tax. And it is a little bit related to the UN Tax Convention, because as you hear Marcus say, we need polluter-pays taxes at the national EU level and at the global level. So it is also part of the UN Tax Convention negotiations. But enough from my side. I am, by the way, Tova Writing. I coordinate the tax team at Eurodad. And we thought about how can we tell the story about the UN Tax Convention. And we thought, why not hear it from the people that are sweating on the front line? And we have, I think we're trying also to connect Evelyn. Hopefully she will join. But we'll go first to, if you've been at the UN Tax Convention negotiations, I don't think Riyadh needs introduction, but I'll do it anyway. You have some people that arrive at the UN for the first time and you sort of see, wow, they don't think this world makes sense. And then you have other people where it's just fish in water. You just see the stars in their eyes and like, woof. And I think told you already on your second day that you were just like, where have you been? And so Riyad Zamani from CCFT, our French member, has been working very, very hard on the front line of the UN Tax Convention negotiations since you joined us. It's almost 1.5 years now. And Riyad is going to talk a bit about how did we get to where we are, but also what is it like as a Eurodad member to fight this battle from the front row. So I'll hand the microphone to you.
Thank you so much, Tove, and thank you for inviting me on this panel. I thought maybe after now 5 sessions of the Tax Convention and many calls with Tove and many WhatsApp messages where I was like, Tove, can you take some time please to explain to me what CPCR is and transparency and beneficial ownership, blah, blah, blah. Now I can almost consider myself as a tax dinosaur. Almost. And so just maybe starting with an anecdote still on the journey to understand also where we are, and also that this huge UN tax convention process doesn't come out of the blue. I think 2 days ago with Mathieu, who's here, my colleague, we were doing at the SSFD's office some recycling. And I had the opportunity to do some recycling in Lison's stuff. Lison was the former tax justice advocacy officer at CCFD, and she hasn't thrown away a single thing for many years. So I was thinking we could open some kind of, tax justice museum with a whole BEPS ale. But the good thing is that when you see all the stuff, you see also the journey, and what a long journey to have those UN tax convention negotiations. I feel grateful because I feel like I arrived at the most crucial moment, and I'm being served UN tax convention negotiations as if it were something that was easy to get. But when looking at all those documents and all those articles and all those reports saying we need global tax rules, we need negotiations at the United Nations, and all the answers and all the papers also saying it is impossible, you will never get this at the UN. I was saying, wow, this feels like a crazy journey, and just maybe starting by saying that I feel really grateful to be part of this process, and also to be able to work on this thing that many people have been working on way before me and have spent many years and a lot of energy on. And so maybe that was my starting point. Now I think that I would just I don't want to be too long, but I wanted to share some insights on from a European perspective, and also a member of Eurodad, of our work in this UN tax convention process. Of course, that is a global work, and we're working all together, and maybe sharing some European perspective. And of course, then I think Evelyn will give us also her perspective on this. I think that as Europeans, evolving in this process is a bit tricky, because we're faced with a continent that is nothing but a solid, coherent block. We're basically in the same continent, part of one of the biggest parts of the problem, but also maybe part of the solution somehow. And it's a bit difficult and tricky to evolve in this situation. How you have amongst the biggest tax havens in Europe, and you also have some of the biggest losers of the tax system. And so I think somehow it's a bit tricky, but also it gives us a bit, and it has given us a bit from the start what the strategy of us Europeans is in this negotiations. And it's, let's put it simply, it's to split Europe. It's to split Europe between the countries that are gaining from a very flawed, outdated, unfair tax system, and the ones who have interest having an alliance with global South countries that are the most screwed by the global tax system, and that could understand that maybe if they joined forces with the global South, maybe they also gain something. And I think, so really, I think that this idea of trying to split Europe and to make to take advantage from the fact that it's not a coherent, solid bloc with shared interests, I think it's really important in our shared strategy. And I know something about this because I think, so my country, France, is one of the most telling examples in that regard. France is not a tax haven. It's basically screwed by its neighbors, tax havens, Luxembourg, Switzerland. Dominic is not here, so hi Dominic, if you hear us from Switzerland. But at the same time, the tricky thing is that it is one of the countries that defend the most the actual system. And this is because, and this is where we see also the big play in which we're operating, is that you have on the one side, on the one hand, you have the economic, the tax, the budget interest. If it were only about this, somehow it would be easy because most countries in the world have an interest in having more tax revenues. I mean, what country can say today, I have enough tax revenues to fund all my policies and my public services and my fight against climate change? But it's not that easy because, of course, we're at the UN and tax is a purely political and geopolitical issue. And so you see that some countries are putting also the big geopolitical play plays a big role in this. And for example, France is a telling example because France has the headquarters of the OECD, has also for the people, the Club de Paris. And so it hosts today the institution somehow that has been preventing us from having a fairer tax system, which makes it tricky because at the same time, France is a country that loses, I think, according to Tax Justice Network, it's the second country that has lost the most tax revenues between 2016 and 2021. It's huge. So it means that, I am just taking France as an example of, it's tricky because if it were as easy as convincing countries that they need to change rules because they would get money, I think we would already have a UN tax convention written, right? So then, what is our role then? And I think it gives us also a bit of also the kind of the tasks we've assigned ourselves and the strategy we've been trying to follow as Europeans since the beginning. I think one of the most important things we've been trying to do, and I'll share some experience, especially in France, is to increase external pressure. Because I think that in terms of advocacy, of course, it is really difficult to make our European pro-OECD countries change their mind overnight. And I think that in that regard, and to imagine that our European countries will become champions of the UN Tax Convention overnight. I don't believe this, and I think that this is why also we have a very, we have to work closely also with our Global South colleagues, is because they're the ones who need to find the champions and to make the champions champion the process. At the same time, as Europeans, what we're trying to do is somehow also try to shame our countries, I don't like to say this, but to throw them under the bus, and to show the world that some of those countries are playing against their own interests. And I think the more we manage to show citizens that those countries are playing also against their own interests, the more interest we will get from the people, the more political pressure we will get on those countries. I think this is one of the most important things we've been trying to do. And this, it is not an easy task, of course, but also I think it's starting also showing some signals of success. And I wanted to share just briefly four things that are really crucial, for me, for the success from a European perspective of the work we're doing. So first, I think that something that is extremely important is the level of coordination that we do have between organizations. Of course, at the global level, but since I'm sharing more of a European perspective, the level of coordination we're trying to have at the European level. Just to share, we're having weekly meetings every Monday at 2 p.m. on the UN Tax Convention. That is to say, we're such at a crucial moment that we're really trying every week to share insights, to share strategies. And it is extremely important because also I think this is also a condition to success is to be able to learn from other organizations, from other countries, from other contexts. And having this space where we share also good practices. Oh, I've done this with my MPs, and I've contacted this amount of media, and I've found this way of creating interest and gathering momentum around that precise aspect, and blah blah blah. I think it is extremely useful, and I think it's been crazy because I think when we have a lot of meetings, all of us in our organizations, and when you're telling someone, yeah, we're just going to add a weekly meeting every Monday, no one is going to be like, yeah, let's go. But I think it's one of the meetings where I see the highest level of energy. People are always so happy to be there and to keep on moving on and make the agenda move forward. Honestly, I wanted to share this first thing because I think it's extremely important, the level of coordination we're trying to have between European organizations, not just tax justice organizations, not just economic justice organizations, but also many different types of organizations, climate organizations, human rights organizations. And I think also this is the condition to success, being able to kind of like broaden our scope and to say this fight is not just the fight of organizations working on tax justice or economic justice. It is a fight of many organizations. And I think we really tried to create this dynamic, and I think this dynamic is really important. Second thing, again, in this, which I think to me is the condition to success in those negotiations, especially at the European level, is, as I said, creating external pressure. And by one of the most efficient way, I think, to create external pressure is to involve other political actors than the delegates and the ministries, and especially the very conservative ministries of finance. So I think we've been trained a lot to mobilize members of parliaments. It's been quite a journey too, because we've had some obstacles also, countries not wanting to have their own members of parliament in the negotiations and battles involving Russia and blah, blah, blah. But we've managed, I think, the last negotiations, there was a French MP, for example, came in Nairobi last time, there were MEPs, but also outside of the sessions, I think we're increasingly trying to involve members of parliament because also they have some legitimacy somehow that we're lacking, and also some pressure that we're also lacking, and they have the ability to ask the government to be accountable for their choices. And in tax matters, it's huge. They can knock to the door of the government and say, well, what are you saying? Those people are telling us that basically there's a convention with trillions of dollars that we could get a lot of tax revenues, and they're saying that you're not doing anything about it. Can you please tell us what your position on this is? And for example, in France, we've managed to organize hearings at the French Parliament, some questions to the government, also some resolution proposals, and I think it's going forward. And we're seeing also in other countries that many colleagues are now also really trying to involve members of their national parliaments. Also with one thing, is because this convention at the end will be voted and ratified by members of parliaments. So it's also a good thing to say to parliamentarians, you have a say, because at the end, this is something you will have to ratify and vote on. So you'd rather be involved in the writing part of the process. So I think this is extremely important, and we're really trying to do this increasingly. And as the process is moving forward, I think the implication of members of parliament will be crucial. So the third thing was the close collaboration with other CSOs from other fields. I think I mentioned this. So I'll go directly to the fourth one, which I think, and it's a personal opinion, is the most crucial to make this negotiation a success. And I think it's media work. Media work is difficult. It requires a lot of energy. It requires a lot of strategy. It requires a lot of effort. But at the end of the day, if we are not able to create enough media attention on what we're doing, I think we are also preventing ourselves from a huge tool to make this a success. Because media work increases political attention, and political attention increases media attention, and it's a virtuous cycle. And I think a few months ago, some of us were maybe thinking it's super difficult to make national media interested in something that is UN and seems super far. But I think it's also a matter of not at some point sitting around the table and saying, okay, what kind of strategy can we find? What kind of angles can we find to make the media have interest in this? And the good thing in Europe is that most of the countries are obsessed with national budgetary crisis. This is our door. This is our entry point. This is a perfect entry point, because actually what we're working on is finding solutions to also your national budgetary crisis. So what we've been, and in France, we've been trying to do this a lot, also working a lot with other colleagues, especially from the climate movement. For example, what we've been trying to do is just reacting basically to any kind of article talking about taxes. And when seeing that, that's what I've been doing. When seeing that there might be a potential angle to make our messages or UN tax convention story enter into the story, I would just write a message, write an email to a journalist, throwing a bottle in water and saying, maybe eventually the journalist will answer. And it has proven to be quite successful. It is working. Journalists are actually picking up on the story, are saying, actually, that's interesting. Also because we're talking about windfall profits, and we're talking about budgetary crisis and tax rich and blah, blah, blah. And at the end of the day, when you try to connect the dots and make them understand that all those issues are super related, it's really starting working. Sorry, I'm a bit long, and I just wanted to really insist, if you need, and since we're talking about conditions of success of the tax dimension, I think really media work is really important. But the condition to media work, I think, is also expressing sharp positions. I think really in that matter, expressing sharp positions, showing that we do have sharp positions, it creates a lot of interest. We've been saying this, for example, that France was hosting the G7. We as civil society, as I said, then other French CSOs have been trying to express very sharp positions on economic justice. And guess what? Media and journalists are really interested when we have sharp positions. And I will end up with one thing, which I think is, I don't know if it's a sign of future success, but I think for me, it's a sign that we're on the good way, is that the last time I met my negotiators, they were really angry at me. They were yelling at me, extremely aggressive, which has not been the case so far, because they were starting panicking about the fact that maybe eventually global South countries have a majority at the UN, and that there's a work where they can make this convention voted and that they can make this successes. And the moment they realize this, they starting being really aggressive. And seeing this for me was a sign that we're on the good.
Thank you so much, Leah. And I think there's a lot to say because you've been working like mad since you arrived. And thank you for recapping all the fantastic work that you're doing. And speaking of fantastic work, Evelyn, we're extremely happy to have you here. I hope you can hear me. If you've been at the UN Tax Convention negotiations, Evelyn also needs absolutely no introduction. But for the rest of you, Evelyn is with Tax Justice Network Africa, but she is also one of the many coordinators we have in different constellations in the convention negotiations. And in particular, Evelyn coordinates the work around the first protocol on taxation of digital services. That might sound a bit geeky, but it all comes down to money and power. And that's one of the many coordination functions that Evelyn has. And I think Evelyn is also a person who a few years ago you were still we were still welcoming you as a new, but I think now now I just actually Ria pointed out, people become dinosaurs extremely quickly, and I think you you are already an extremely central part of the work and of the team that we've all become. And so very happy to have you here, also because we would not be here if it wasn't for the leadership of the African governments, but also first and foremost of African civil society. So I give you the floor to tell us a bit about how we got here, but also about the work that you do and the opportunities and challenges going forward. Thank you, Evelyn.
Thanks. Thanks, Tove. Those were very kind words. I really appreciate them. So how we got here, I'm going to try and summarize because really we could have a whole day conversation on this. So I'll start with the fact that the reality is many of our countries didn't begin as colonies. Many of our countries actually began as multinational corporations. So Kenya used to be known as British East Africa Company. South Africa used to be known as British South Africa Company, and so forth and so on. So you can see that very early on, multinational corporations that were present in Africa were all about extractivism. And the thing is, once they left, we inherited tax systems that continued to perpetuate extractivism. So, and then we also got into double taxation agreements that continued to perpetuate extractivism. So essentially, there was no fair allocation of taxing rights in most of the double taxation agreements that we got into. And that was also because we were not even part of formulating the fundamental international tax rules, which happened around the 20s and to the 40s, to the 1940s. And that's because we didn't even have political independence. We didn't have that sort of recognition. So we never had a seat at the table, and we inherited systems that absolutely just never favored our interests or promoted our interests. And so for almost, I think, a century, this system has continued to persist. And also because of the liberalization sort of agenda of the 90s and 80s that was, of course, also forwarded by international financial institutions, African governments also started seeing double taxation agreements as investment tools, and as a result, started giving away so many concessions through these double taxation agreements. And then now we're in the 2000s and the 2010s and the 2020s, and when the tax justice movement sort of started taking shape within the continent, we started being more aware of, the tax element and the agreements that we have with other countries, particularly our previous colonizers, and how harmful they were. There are also other agreements. I'm sure the trade guys, you will have a lot to say about bilateral investment treaties, the mining agreements that we got into also at the same time. But DTAs were part of the problem, but they only sort of gained recognition much later on than other aspects of economic justice. And of course, around that time, we also started doing advocacy, particularly on double taxation agreements, including also public interest litigation cases. And also around that time, what began to take shape within Africa was the conversation about illicit financial flows. And this was the combined effort of the African Union and UNECA, the United Nations Economic Commission of Africa. And they formulated the high-level panel on illicit financial flows. And the findings of this were very interesting because the common narrative that we had been taught since I was in school was that the biggest problem, the biggest financial problem Africa faces was corruption. And then we came to find out that the biggest problem actually was commercially driven illicit financial flows, which I think accounted for around 65% of the total of illicit financial flows. And then criminally, I think was around 30-something percent. And then finally, corruption was only 5%. So we came to realize that, we had been doing so much advocacy on corruption, which is also, a very legitimate movement. It's also a very legitimate concern. But we had been allowing multinational corporations to essentially continue with extractivism, including in eroding our tax bases for so long. And then the crazy thing for us was that in a lot of ways, this wasn't illegal. This was, as lawyers will say, illegal. It wasn't illegal per se. It was within the confines of the law, but of course it was against the spirit of the law. And so after the launch of the high-level panel report, which was chaired by the former president of South Africa, His Excellency Thabo Mbeki, there started to be some sort of movement within the continent on addressing illicit financial flows. And very early on, we realized that we could not do this without international cooperation. We also realized, and this was actually one of the recommendations of that report, that we needed to have a UN body that would essentially be the custodian of this work, where we would be able to, on equal footing, have conversations about addressing illicit financial flows within Africa, have conversations about the equitable taxation of multinational corporations on equal footing. And so that started around 2015, which was also the time, of course, you had the Financing for Development Conference 3. I wasn't physically present, and I would like to acknowledge all the people who were there and all the people who are fighting for a UN tax body even then. And so it's a combination of different fights that all came together. And so for the next 5 years, a lot was done, particularly continentally, on coming up with strategies to address illicit financial flows. But at the same time, as much as we were really looking internally within Africa to find solutions, we really hadn't answered the question of how do we find a solution in terms of international cooperation. And ironically, it was the OECD also that helped us to get here, because I know a couple of countries had joined the inclusive framework, I think around 2016, as much as they were not part of, the formulation of the agenda, the formulation of the minimum standards of the inclusive framework on BEPS and the BEPS action plan. They still joined, and they actually joined in good faith because they genuinely wanted to find solutions. And they participated in those processes. They started taking measures to also introduce new tax measures domestically, and they did all of that. But really what pushed them to the edge was the two-pillar solution. Because these countries participated in good faith, they expressed their concerns about the global minimum tax, they expressed their concerns about Pillar 1, and they were simply not heard. And in 2021, they actually outrightly rejected the two-pillar solution. And this was Kenya and Nigeria as two African countries that outrightly rejected the two-pillar solution. And I find it interesting. I remember sitting in on one meeting where a Nigerian delegate was describing the Pillar 1. And I remember he said, it's like having, a piece of loaf. Pillar 1 is about having a piece of loaf and then figuring out how to share it. And he said the way the rules under Pillar 1 are right now is that Africa will basically get negative loaf. And he was so pained by the whole idea, particularly because also Pillar 1 was demanding that we drop any domestic measures. And for big market jurisdictions like Nigeria and Kenya, that was a hard no. And so, of course, there was pushback, a lot of pushback on these individual countries when they said no. I won't go into the details of that, but there was a lot of pushback. But eventually also, I think it all came together because also the advocacy that had been done by the same civil society organizations that were there at the Financing for Development Conference 3 finally bore fruit, because in 2022, finally, Nigeria, on behalf of the Africa Group, tabled a resolution for international tax cooperation at the United Nations, where we could finally start negotiating tax rules on an equal footing, and also where we could finally have international tax cooperation that is effective. People normally only focus on the inclusive part and completely forget the effective part, because just as Riyadh has mentioned, in a lot of ways, these international tax rules are also not working for global north countries, for developed countries. However, I guess it's very difficult to change status quo because we faced a lot of resistance from the development of the terms of reference, even now during negotiations. And I find it very interesting. Some African delegates often tell me, because they're the same people who also participate in the inclusive framework, when we are negotiating with the same people in the inclusive framework, they're much more reasonable. 1 + 1 is 2. 1 + 1 is not 3, which is often the case during UN tax negotiations. Simple things don't become complex. People are actually negotiating in good faith during the inclusive framework negotiations, but then the same people during the UN tax convention negotiations want us to define everything. They want us to even define tax. They refuse to accept the UN definition of illicit financial flows. They would rather use their own term, base erosion and profit shifting. So there's that push and pull, but also there's an understanding that we really are trying to overturn a system that existed for almost a century, but we continue pushing on as African countries, as African civil society organizations. We now have an African Civil Society Working Group on the UN Tax Convention, where we mobilize civil society organizations to do work within their own countries on pretty much advocacy on the UN Tax Convention. And one of the things that I am really proud of is the fact that for the first time ever, we're having multilateral international tax negotiations in Africa, and particularly, of course, in Nairobi. And it makes such a world of difference in terms of participation and inclusivity. And even though we haven't finished the process and we're facing very many difficulties, it really does make me proud to see that level of participation, particularly from, of course, both the African delegation as well as African civil society organizations. And as much as they wouldn't like to admit it, I do believe that also the Global North negotiators prefer Nairobi as the venue for negotiations. But really, we continue to do the advocacy to push for a UN tax convention. We continue also trying to develop a common position within Africa on the UN tax convention and a couple of issues, even on the protocols. And that's our work within the continent, because we're also not a homogeneous people. Different countries have different interests, and aligning 54 countries is not easy, but we continue to do that also with different languages and language groups. And so we also continue working of course, with the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. And we really, really appreciate the work that happens between us, particularly, and our Global North colleagues. And I'd like to say, at the very least, within civil society, we are pretty much the example of what global solidarity should look like. This is what negotiators should actually mimic. This is what they should pick up. So it's very, very, very important that we keep that going, that we work with each other to keep this sort of work going, this collaboration and coordination between us going, so that in the end, really, we can be successful and come out with an agreement that is mutually beneficial. As much as African countries started this, it's not just our document. It really is supposed to be a global document that supports and has something for also global North countries. It's not just African countries or global South countries. And I think that's a message that we need to keep carrying forward. So I'm going to stop there, but happy to keep going, Tove.
Happy to keep going. I think that sums you up very well, Everett. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you also for your inputs on how we got here. And I think in terms of the global coordination, so Riyad mentioned that every Monday at 2:00, please feel free to join the European UN Tax Convention negotiations. But we also have the global coordination calls, and we have the next call coming up on the 25th of June, also at 2:00. And it's work that's been co-coordinated by Eurodad and the Secretariat of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice for a very long time. It's Dereje and I who've been coordinating the global calls. And it's been a long journey from you'll never ever get a UN tax convention to we even had some people after the process had been adopted telling us if we weren't going to get it in the next decade, and we had to tell people we just got it actually. So you might want to update your talking points. And it's indeed been, I think, a very, very long ride. And today, I think the Global Alliance is often mentioned in the context of the UN Tax Convention work, but actually, I think there is another work stream of the Global Alliance, which is very important to notice as well. And it is the Tax and Gender Working Group. And today, tax and gender, if you search on it, you'll find reports from OECD and World Bank and UNDP organizing conferences and I don't know what. But back in 2023, when the Global Alliance was founded, shortly after the Tax and Gender Group was formed, and it was so odd, people were responding as if we were suggesting to mix hot dogs and whipped cream. It was, yes, great, what do those two things have to do with each other? There was really this, tax has nothing to do with gender equality. They're all very good, but they are completely unrelated. And taking that fight and saying there's no such thing as a gender neutral tax system has been a huge uphill battle. And the Tax and Gender Working Group fought this battle. And at the same time, when Dereje and I and the coordination around the UN Tax Convention worked, and we said, oh, we need a UN process, the Tax and Gender Group was the first one to come behind the banners and say, yes, this is absolutely essential. So the links between the tax and gender work and the UN tax work, they go very far back. And of course, now we're in the fantastic situation that we're drafting the UN Tax Convention. However, of course, we need a very strong gender component in that tax convention, and Rose is here to tell us a bit about that. But I think also as a veteran of the tax and gender work, really this is a very, very important and successful story as well. But the battle continues. So over to you, Rose.
Thank you so much, everyone. And I can't say who's in the room, so what I say might not be new, but I think it's important to be said. And I hope to do justice to the many people who have worked as a part of the Tax and Gender Working Group and on feminist tax justice. And happy to take any notes afterwards, as always. So just to start with saying that no economic policy is gender neutral. This includes tax. It is deeply ingrained in the Washington consensus that policy needs to be neutral. And as others have already said, in reality, tax is deeply political and issues of money and power always are. By ignoring gendered economic realities such as income inequality and unpaid care work, policies reinforce rather than reduce disparities. The entire economy rests on the gender division of labor through women's disproportionate unpaid care and domestic work, which is uncounted in the main economic measure of GDP, which is deeply flawed, and I could talk on for a long time. If unpaid care work were assigned a monetary value, it would exceed up to 40% of GDP in some countries, or 10.8 trillion US dollars globally yearly, which is a likely underestimation. This means that women's enormous unpaid care work subsidy to the economy remains unaccounted for. Global inequality as well remains extreme, with the poorest 50% of people owning just 2% of global wealth and the richest 10% holding 78%, though I'm sure these stats by this point are outdated. This inequality is deeply gendered. Women's share of global labor income is less than 35% today. The gender wage gap is estimated at 20%, meaning that women earn 80% of what men earn for the same jobs, though these figures estimate the real extent of gender payment gaps. And obviously, these are very different in regional context as well. But this is still true for European context as well. There is no gender equality in no country. At the same time, men take a lot of their income through business structures with low tax rates and less through salaries. Just another measure is that women only own 20% of land and around 33 to 40% of assets with huge regional variation. So this has implications for earnings as well. Global illicit financial flows, as already mentioned, play a role in wealth accumulation for a few. Africa loses around 89 billion per year, according to UNCTAD, facilitating this extraction of resources through the global north, making Africa a net contributor to the world economy when taking into account FDA and ODA. As Evelyn already mentioned, this negative loaf that Africa gets. At the same time, African countries are taking loans from the IMF to prioritize debt repayments that were issued in the first hand with really high unfair interest loans. Women and structurally marginalized groups are most impacted by this, for example, through cuts in public services, as ActionAid showed last year in our report, The Human Cost of Public Sector Cuts in Africa survey last year. We did this survey to show the missing stats of GDP and the impact in economic policy, which has a significant lag. Women also disproportionately work in the informal sector, leading to the false idea that women don't pay taxes. They do, through VAT and standard market fees, and they don't benefit from the tax exemptions more formal businesses have that disproportionately benefit men, to talk of the incorporation that Evelyn also talked about. In compensating for low revenue from the private sector, governments increasingly rely on indirect taxes such as VAT, actively pushed by international institutions such as the OECD and the IMF, which impacts lower households more, meaning they pay a disproportionate share of their income in taxes, and women make up a larger share of lower income households, so I don't have to finish that thought there. Women also have less of a say in economic policy. Only 11% of ministries of finance are women, and only 27% of parliamentarians around the world are women. We saw the effect of this lack of political inclusion during the COVID emergency policies, which largely ignored unpaid care work burdens, such as homeschooling. At the UN, states have agreed to several human rights commitments on substantive gender equality. In 1979, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and Girls, also known as CEDAW, and the 1995 Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action were agreed. Despite these commitments by all member states, we are seeing actually a global regression of women's rights and gender equality, and I cannot stress this enough. This is partly due to the massive public sector cuts. We're seeing austerity globally. Also, there is a very well-organized and well-funded backlash on gender, which goes hand in hand with the authoritarianism we're seeing around the world and the increasing conflict and militarism. If we are silent on gender equality, we are complicit in this regression. Rights are hard won and easily lost. So the international financial system was built this way to enable this wealth extraction from the global north to the global south, as Evelyn already said. This is reinforced by intersecting systems of oppression, including gender inequality. Have you ever wondered why so many European countries are tax havens and enable corporate secrecy? I think Riyad and Evelyn already answered this question. Our colonial architecture to this day shapes global economic rules. This is not a distant history. British taxpayers paid off compensation to former slave owners until 2015. Under the Slave Compensation Act of 1837, the British government paid former slave owners 20 million, the equivalent of $17 billion today, to compensate them for the loss of their enslaved human property. I'll just pause there for a moment so you can let that sink in. We know the current global tax system fails to achieve human rights and development goals. It serves to concentrate wealth and power while marginalizing women, indigenous peoples of African descent, and other oppressed groups. The UN Tax Convention isn't really a chance to create an inclusive, fair, transparent, efficient, equitable, effective international tax system for sustainable development, fit for our times. European countries claim to support gender equality in global arenas very often, while at the same time undermining this with its tax policies. This hypocrisy needs to be called out, as I wrote with Caroline Otim, a former coordinator of the Tax and Gender Working Group at GATCH, in a critical reflection criticizing this feminist policy making. European governments really need to support the UN Tax Convention and champion the gender equality within it, and not use gender equality as something to hide behind. A tiny bit of work supporting gender equality abroad through a tiny percentage, less than 0.1%, that goes through women's rights organizations through a small amount of ODA, is entirely undone by an unjust financial system and tax rules. So we already have an unfair system. We don't need another one. The UN Tax Convention is an opportunity to support fair global tax rules where countries have taxing rights on their own jurisdictions, as Riyad and Evelyn already mentioned. The negotiation process is, as also already said, a testament to the enormous strength and diversity of global civil society and the collaborations at GATCH, and the role that the Tax and Gender Working Group has played in bringing in different things. So just to end on the asks on the UN Tax Convention by the feminist groups, which there's a statement online I'll share in the chat, that the convention must commit to ensuring fiscal systems are fully in line with member states' existing obligations to progressively realize human rights and gender equality to the maximum available of their resources. It should commit to ensuring tax systems and international tax rules actively promote gender equality and eliminate gender biases in tax legislation and administration. It should ensure transparency and accountability systems towards commitment on gender equality and tax through gender disaggregated data. This is important to show really what is happening, including through regular reporting by states on these issues. So just lastly, European governments really need to get behind this and support global South governments that have been calling for tax justice, among other things. European governments' negotiating tactics might seem subtle in regional context, but on the global arena, it is entirely transparent. They don't want to give up power or their tax havens. This is entirely telling. And outside of tax arenas, we see that global South governments say entirely different things in New York City at the UN on the Financing for Development yearly meeting versus what they say in Washington at the IMF and World Bank meetings. And this is testament to show what a truly equitable platform can do for tax rules at the UN as opposed to where they are now. So a truly tax system is not just about removing explicit gender discrimination. It is also about designing policies that actively close gender gaps. Tax justice is gender justice. So let us seize this opportunity to build an equitable tax system that truly serves all. Happy to expand on any of that. Thanks, Tove.
Thank you so much. Well, it's fantastic. And oh yes, I should have said, so Voices from Action Aid International, as you can see on the screen. And what you've heard now is the inputs from 3 different people who have been to the front line and fought in the negotiations. And one of the calls that we've had over the last year is we need help. Come help us out. So please do consider yourself encouraged to follow the work. And if ever you happen to be in New York or Nairobi at the right time, please come join us. Enough. Now we have about half an hour for questions, comments, inputs, anything. Anyone to break the ice. And hopefully now you will also see who's in the room. Nobody has any questions.
I can break this. So I'm not really the person to break the ice because I have no idea what we're talking about. But I am responding to your invitation. My name is Chloe. I work for Peace Direct. So we work on peace building, conflict prevention, and I'm here to learn about all of these issues. You mentioned working with people from other sectors, and that's something I'm trying to do at the moment in Brussels. Monday, I was at an event on militarism and fighting, the directions of the EU foreign policy when it comes to working for peace, working and talking to people working on human rights and climate. Anyway, so I'm here to basically learn about debt and to learn about tax and to know what I can take from this in the spaces I have access to. And how we can also kind of connect. I've connected with some of you at the OECD spaces. One of the work that we do at Peace Direct is on locally led peace building development, advocating for civil society in the global south. So there's obviously so many connections. You don't need to answer today, but just to say a plea or kind of tell me how we can work together. I know I have much to read and to be educated about. But this is, me breaking the ice. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Yes, we have something on that, but let's take a few more questions before we.
Hi, it's Kamal from the Institute for Economic Justice. I have a question for Evelyn and for Rus and others who have been involved in the negotiations. What is the strategy for engaging delegates directly? And how can we leverage that in our pursuit of a UN debt convention? Thank you.
I think that one will be for you, Evelyn. Good. A few more questions? Just to say, the other parts of the room are allowed to ask questions too. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. This is Valentina from Humanity and Inclusion. I joined the first person who raised hand, also new to the conversation, but I think that today anyone working on topics related to social inclusion, social justice, should be at least aware of what's happening in terms of tax justice, economic justice, debt, and all the topics that you're addressing today. My question regarding the convention is about the actual opponents that you are facing. And you mentioned the first speaker, sorry, I don't recall the name. You mentioned how it felt right that they were aggressive towards you at some point. But yeah, maybe just wanted to understand a bit more who these opponents are and what are the arguments that have over the year prevailed, such leading to the delay of this convention, because I think it was probably due even earlier than now. So yeah, knowing a bit more, what are you facing in terms of challenges when it comes to advocating for the cause? Thanks.
What a great question. So first we get a download from Riyadh of all the things that you're hearing from the negotiators, and then over to Evelyn also about how we work with the negotiators. And then lastly, I think for all of you, I think the intersectionality and connecting with other movements is really crucial, not least at this point in time. But Leah first.
Yes, thank you so much. I'll try to be quick, maybe answering to the first and the last questions. I think that for the first question, for me, I think tax justice and more broadly economic justice is a condition to peace. And I think that somehow this is something we need to hammer. I mean, in order to have peace, we also need to have economic justice. And maybe in a very concrete way, the way we can work together is that I think maybe the kind of people you're or the kind of official people you're working with are much more diplomats, I guess, or people, yeah, not maybe people from tax administration. At the same time, the problem we're facing is that most of the people we're engaging with are tax administrators, people from tax administrations. They're kind of like monopolizing all the space in those negotiations. And what basically we need is also to see all other ministries, other people, diplomats, people working on environment, people working on peace, to tell them that what is happening now at the UN is that we could get the money to finance peace, we could get the money to finance the fight against climate change. So somehow I think that also this is in the bringing this UN tax convention story and towards new other kind of official, other kind of institutional people, especially diplomats, and try to make them increase the pressure on people from ministries of finance. I think for me, it's a very concrete way to how we can work together in order to increase the political pressure. On the last question, I think that, yeah, I mean, opponents, yeah, I think that, I mean, it's, looking at the Europeans, it's so crazy because you have two types of, as I said, at the very beginning, you have the tax havens. For them, it's easy. It's just their whole economic model. Their economy is based on just basically like stealing the money from the others and just, I mean, for them, it's crystal clear, right? But for other countries, especially countries that are high tax countries, like France, for example, we see three kinds of arguments they bring up. First, it's the arguments that, you know, the system is as such, it cannot be changed. Those people that have been bottle fed for a century, I mean, not themselves for a century, but I mean, still in their lifetime, they have been bottle fed. The idea that transfer pricing is the best thing. The system only works with transfer pricing, with arm's length principle, with permanent establishment, and so on and so forth. And so they look at you being like, okay, but another system is not possible. So I think first argument is really this, is the people we're engaging with, they truly believe, some of them, that another system is not possible because they've been bottle fed the idea that this system is this system and it cannot be another one. But I think the second one is as I said, the more of like the power play, the geopolitical arguments, the fact that they would not give up on having the pen in writing the rules, even if the rules do not always benefit them. And I think it's really difficult when you face this, but I think that, as I said, the way to circumvent this is really to try to increase external political pressure. And I think that the last argument sometimes is not just bad faith, is deeply rooted colonial thinking. And I can see this, for example, with the French delegates. It's crazy when you're mentioning, for example, the TAs. They're basically telling, so double tax agreements, they're basically telling you, yeah, but I mean, you know, it's an agreement. It's been decided between two countries, and since it's been decided between two countries, it is fair. So they do not even recognize the fact that an agreement that has been agreed upon two countries might be also the place of power plays and power imbalances. And I think something that it's really, we've identified this, and this is something that we really need to fight against, but it's extremely difficult. It's really those arguments really rooted into deeply rooted colonial and post-colonial thinking. So I think these are the three kind of arguments we're facing with our opinions.
Fantastic. And Evelyn, on how do we work with the delegates, and what can others learn from the way that you and everybody else is working at the UN Tax Convention negotiations?
To borrow the words of Dr. Leila Latif, I think the first step is you need to understand who holds the pen. You need to understand who is in a position to actually influence the process. And I think, as Riyadh has sort of alluded to, it's very important to work with the diplomats and at the same time also working with the capitals, the ministries of finance and tax administrations. And actually, the best thing is when both of them work together, both the diplomats as well as the tax administrations or ministries of finance. That is actually when we get the best outcomes. And I think we really saw that during the stage of the development of terms of reference. I think something else that we shouldn't take for granted is relationship building. And this takes years. And I'll really give credit to, the civil society organizations that have been doing this since 2015 from FFD3. It is not easy, but it really does have the best outcomes because it also takes time to capacitate, for instance, diplomats on the importance of this process, on what the interests are and what we're trying to do. At the same time, it also takes time to garner political support for the diplomats from the capitals so they can actually get the resources that they need, meaning human resources, so that they can do the negotiations and they can push certain agenda at the UN in New York. So that's one thing. I think I wouldn't know what strategies would specifically work in European countries, but as per our experience in Africa, as per our experience in Tax Justice Network Africa, very early on, we realized that we're going to need to formulate a common African position, and this is going to be a sort of all hands on deck approach. So we're working with ATAF, we're working with the tax administration, we're also working with AU, we're also working with UNECA to sort of bring the negotiators together so we can come up with a common African position. And we sort of formed like a loose mechanism that we call the interinstitutional coordination mechanism, where we're leveraging on each other's strengths to mobilize support and also to really drive the technical work forward. Because there's always been expertise within the continent. There has always been expertise. We just need to bring it together. We're also really trying to tap into the knowledge and expertise of our own African academia. I know Professor Atia Waris is in the audience. And so it's very important to bring all these stakeholders together. And I think that's something that we keep trying to do. I will say it's not easy. These are people who have, if to put it politely, day jobs. They already have responsibilities, they have revenue targets. And so you can really see that there's a lot of personal sacrifice and a lot of commitment and a lot of heart, really, that is being put into this process. And I think essentially those are the things I will say that have contributed to us having sort of relationships with our negotiators and also working with them to influence them. And I will say sometimes it's okay to disagree. Sometimes even if we're working together, it's okay to disagree. We are civil society at the end of the day. And sometimes we like to joke with tax administrators that we will never be this friendly back in our own home countries. But on the UN Tax Convention, we're completely united. So it's also a balance of, as civil society, knowing when to push further, knowing when to ask for more. Because as civil society, we must always be the most ambitious. We must work from the most ambitious, what is the most ambitious position? And then from there, we let the diplomats and the negotiators do their thing. But first, it must always be what is most ambitious. We must always push for that. And I think we've been doing that. I know this question wasn't for me, but I will comment on, why we're facing so much opposition and so much pushback. I will say it's also rather confusing for us when we see particularly high tax jurisdictions and low tax jurisdictions from Europe on the same side. We will think that high tax, the tax havens, but you will think that a high tax jurisdiction from Europe will not be on the same page as a low tax jurisdiction. And so I think there's also a certain reframing that we need to do, because I think most people think this is a global north versus global south thing, when it's really high tax jurisdictions versus low tax jurisdictions thing. It's really, that's the dichotomy. It's not global north versus global south. And so we find that many European negotiators approach this from the point of, we don't want to change status quo. status quo is working for us, which is a lie, it isn't. And so we really think we need to reframe that, because sometimes, and sometimes we can make the moral arguments, but the moral arguments sometimes don't move negotiators. But what really moves them is appealing to their own interests and appealing to their own self-interest, telling them you have failed spectacularly, no offense, on taxation of the digital economy. So this is your chance to come up with another approach, because as we speak right now, we are all losing out. And the reality is, one country, a couple of countries, even a whole continent cannot stand up against which country when it comes to fighting for our tax sovereignty. But when we build a coalition of the willing, when we build a proper coalition, both among global North countries and global South countries, we can really push for reform and just sort of say, it's all of us against one country. So eventually something will have to give. I hope I'm making sense. I hope the things I'm not saying are still hard. Thank you.
I have yet to see a day where you don't make sense of it, and thank you so much. And lastly, on the intersectionality and any other inputs that you have, Mo's, please.
Thanks. Yeah, just I guess the tax havens sort of. So I'm from the Netherlands and I'm currently in the UK. Stall tactics that were already mentioned. Defining more, like it's just a stall tactic, and it's so transparent, like I said. And also this sort of like line of like, we need no duplication, meaning, we have the OECD stuff. It is just so self-interested and transparent that, like if some of the European negotiators would spend more time outside of their European or global North bubbles, I think they would see the fallacy in that. And that brings me to the point of like exposing false narratives, which I think has already been sort of touched on, like the status quo isn't working. This is a zero-sum game, essentially. And this sort of pinkwashing that European governments involve in saying, oh, but within FFD4, we've pushed for gender equality. If we wouldn't have done it, then it wouldn't be there. It's okay, but what are you really doing in practice about gender equality? And how are all the economic policies that affect countries outside that have extraterritorial impacts, how are they actually undermining gender equality and women's rights? So exposing those false narratives, I think, is really important because it shows that there are no wins there. And as Riyadh said, it is a condition to peace. We are at the same level of global inequality as we were 100 years ago. And I don't need to remind you what happened. And I think we're already seeing that in action, the consequences of that. And it is truly terrifying. And I say that with all the privilege I have of being in a country that's safe at the moment, and being able to, in principle, travel with my European passport to countries that many of our colleagues for who this is so important are not able to travel to. So I think an opportunity to bridge to peace organizations, and especially women's peace organizations, who have really also led in ensuring that women who are most impacted by conflict, and again, most marginalized in decisions around conflict, are a part of the conversation. And just an ask to really not self-censor ourselves on gender equality. Yes, people might feel more emboldened to say stuff about that, but that shouldn't stop us not talking about it. Like I said, if we're not talking about it, we are complicit in its regression. And we shouldn't, as Evelyn said, water down our asks already before. We have an unfair system. We don't need another one. On tax and gender, if people are interested to learn more, obviously there's the Tax and Gender Working Group. There's a lot of resources I've shared in the chat, and I realize you can't access those. And ActionAid, together with lots of other organizations in that space, are having several sessions on tax and gender, including on the sidelines of the IAFI conference in Cali for any feminist economists that are there on the 8th of July. and other sessions will follow. So please do reach out and join and inform inform yourself or ask questions. Always happy to have a conversation. And that also helps me to learn. So, and then lastly, I think, what was already said again, but global solidarity among civil society is so important. This is really an opportunity we can't let slip, not just for colleagues in the global south, as Evelyn said, it is for all of us. And I think we can show negotiators how it's done, how we collaborate together, and how we have those difficult conversations, because that is important, and that's a part of solidarity and collaboration. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mos. And we have time for a couple of more inputs. First, we've heard some references back to the people who were fighting and got run over in Addis Ababa in 2015, fighting for an intergovernmental tax body. And Dereja, you're definitely one of those. My co-coordinator in the UN Tax Working Group of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice.
Thank you. Actually, I wanted to start with where those guests stopped. One of the characteristics of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, when we created it, was as a solidarity alliance of the global north and the global south, which is based on two principles. One is to respect the agency and advocacy space of the global south countries. The second was to shift from capacity building the south to fighting northern blockers. This was the biggest shift, and that is what has made us work together in solidarity. And always whenever there were negotiations, tax negotiations, to hear Andreas from Norway representing Tax Justice Europe and Tax Justice Norway say, I am ashamed of the position my country has taken in this whole thing. And to hear always Dominic had his face and campaign against the representatives of Switzerland in the meeting. So, but this was a solid way of working together in solidarity. So the paternalistic capacity building era was gone, and the solidarity in fighting a common and general problem came up. The second point I want to make is, actually, when we say big tax countries in Europe, their governments are not representing their people, they are representing the multinationals. Macron stands for Bolloré, not for the people. So that they are interesting, they are representing an interest. So we have to link their position with the position of the multinationals. They are defending, so that is how we can also expose them, why they are betraying their own people when they are going against the UN Tax Convention. So only to raise these 2 points.
Thank you so much, Dereja. And we have one question in the back, and then we do 1 minute inputs and then I promise we're wrapping up.
Thank you. My name is Ramahatafandi, and my organization is called Because Health, based here in Belgium. My question is to Evelyn. I thought it was striking when you talked about the illicit financial flows, and that the part of corruption was only 5%. We used to be told all the time, oh no, it's your fault, it's because your people are so corrupt, that's why you are so poor. My question is, thank you first. I'm very happy to hear about that. Thank you. And my question is, in which country did you do the investigation? And how did you do it? I suppose you are from South Africa. Was it just in South Africa? Thank you.
All right, we'll get to that. Let's do the same round as before. So we start with a quick wrap up from Leah, and then Evelyn, and then Mos. Leah.
Yeah, maybe just to finish, maybe reacting on Dereje's last point. I think I do completely agree with you. Our governments do not necessarily represent people's opinion on the question and people's interest. And I think this is why, going back to one of the things I was doing, I think crucially, going back to the first question as being asked, what is the condition of success of this process? I think it's being able to embark people and the people on this journey and on this fight. And I think on this, for example, in France, the question is gathering momentum, and we see such a difference between what people actually want and what the government is actually doing and fighting for. And I think the more we put this on the spot, the more we are able to empower people. And for example, yesterday we were live on Twitch with Leila from Oxfam, and this was also an attempt to also kind of like a very small attempt to also try to target also young audience, for example, young people, to make them understand that this matters and that they have a voice in this fight. And I think that the more we empower people, the more successful this whole journey can be.
Thank you. Evelyn.
To Rose's point, it's so interesting when you debunk false narratives that have existed for decades now. I really, corruption used to be taught all the way from primary school. So I really understand why it's so shocking to hear that, corruption hasn't always been the biggest problem, financial problem within the continent. So this was as a result of a couple of studies. I know the GFI had already done their estimations of illicit financial flows around that time, but also the high-level panel report had sort of come up with their own estimations of illicit financial flows. And actually at the time, I think they identified that around 50 billion was being lost because of illicit financial flows. And then later on, we had another study that was undertaken by UNCTAD, which showed that it's actually 89 billion US dollars. I don't know how much it's reached at this point, but also there are efforts within the continent, but that was, okay, so firstly, that was an estimation at continental level. So I can't really specify which countries were included and which countries were not included. However, I will say since then, there have been efforts to actually carry out an estimation of illicit financial flows at country level. And I think we've seen some preliminary data for, I think, around 7 to 10 African countries so far. But this is also, again, as a result of the efforts of civil society organizations around that time, because the UN actually does have a formal mandate to carry out the estimation of illicit financial flows. And it's not just in Africa, should be work that's going on as well in other continents. And so it has been ongoing. There also has been a lot of review of methodologies. I'm not an economist, but I will say I also know that there's a refining of that. So yes, I am happy that it was striking. I'm happy that we have debunked that false narrative for at least one person in the room.
So many, I think. Thank you, Evelyn. And lastly, Rose, please.
Okay, no pressure. And I can't see the room, so I'm really curious to see your faces. But yeah, I guess just one thing that we haven't mentioned is sort of the importance of tax justice and a functioning tax system as a part of democratic functioning and accountability of government. And I think this is really important for those working on authoritarianism and things like that. Obviously, with the funding for civil society shrinking, it might be an interesting argument to bring to donors that now are more worried about authoritarianism, that tax justice is a part of democratic functioning. So just one thought in case anyone wasn't convinced yet that this is an important issue. And I guess just to say, like, invite an organization that's currently not a part of this conversation in your country, in your region, and by that I mean subnational region, to speak to your government about the UN Tax Convention, to join a meeting. If your government has a feminist foreign policy, if your government has a feminist foreign policy, speak to them that that is not sufficient if they are not supporting the UN tax convention negotiations in good faith. Go to your ministries of gender and say that this is important, and they need to push their ministries of finance that this is important. There are commitments they have made on gender equality at the UN already. And don't let your governments pinkwash their foreign policies by saying they're working on gender, and they're doing that within the tax convention whilst ignoring all the other important stuff that the global tax rules need, as we've talked about. Thank you.
What a beautiful end, and warm thanks to my fantastic panelists. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much, everyone, and thanks for the work.